the next hour. But there is great concern here. And I speak to politically connected people here, Steve, and what they are telling me is that if there was an election here now, the much more moderate Palestinian Authority would be kicked out, and they believe Hamas would win an election in the West Bank. Just imagine how terrifying a thought that is.
Secretary Antony Blinken tweeted out, met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and reiterated the United States' support for Israel's right to self-defense and reaffirmed our commitment to a two-state solution. Here is Fox News explaining why that will never happen.
But the great concern is here that the protests, the pro-Hamas protests, are growing much stronger throughout the West Bank. Now, overnight, there were clashes between Palestinians and Israeli forces. 9 Palestinians across the West Bank were killed. That brings to more than 100, close to 140 by some counts, the number of Palestinians killed in the West Bank since October 7th. And there have been something like 1,500 or so arrests of Palestinians made. All that is feeding into growing frustration here, growing anger here, growing support for Hamas. Now, we are just after noon on Friday here, which means the mosques throughout the West Bank here in Ramallah obviously are full right now. It is Friday prayers, the traditional day of prayer, but that also has always become the traditional day of protest too. And authorities here and in Israel are expecting perhaps some of the biggest protests we have yet seen in the West Bank. We will shortly be moving towards where we believe one of those protests will be gathering. We'll bring that to you the next hour. But there is great concern here. And I speak to politically connected people here, Steve, and what they are telling me is that if there was an election here now, the much more moderate Palestinian Authority would be kicked out, and they believe Hamas would win an election in the West Bank. Just imagine how terrifying a thought that is, how terrifying a phrase that is to say to any Israeli. We are also hearing talk that Islamic Jihad is becoming a stronger and stronger force, particularly in the northern part of the West Bank, around places like Jenin, where we have seen some of the most intense clashes between Palestinians and the IDF. So if Islamic Jihad is growing in power here, if Hamas is growing its support here, it is of great concern for Israel. So politically, the future is of great concern. Today, the potential protests are of great concern. Steve Ainsley, Brian Lawrence.
And Jonathan, real quick, anyone who says, a two-state solution, that's the answer, like the President of the United States, it would be in the West Bank. And what country, what sane country would say it would be okay to let a terrorist nation form on the West Bank?
Well, I'll tell you this briefly, Brian. I've been coming to Israel for some 2 decades or so now, and to the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and in Gaza. I've spoken to a lot of moderate people who've always talked about a two-state solution, but particularly in Israel now, that is very much not a subject of conversation for anybody. They cannot make peace. They cannot even think about a two-state solution, obviously, with Hamas. So if Hamas were eventually to come to power in the West Bank, then yeah, it's absolutely off the table as far as every single Israeli is concerned. So the political path forward is fraught right now, Brian. Nobody knows what shape that might take. And that's one of the problems. It's one of the things that Secretary of State Antony Blinken wants to talk to the Israeli government about. Somebody has to start coming up with ideas for what comes next. Now, is that going to be an international peacekeeping force in Gaza? Quite possibly. Would that involve U.S. troops on the ground? Quite possibly. So there's a lot of scenarios being discussed, none of them very good at the moment, though, Brian.
All right. Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate it.